Welcome to the Affirming Minds Podcast, where we equip like-minded mental health professionals with a therapeutic toolkit that helps add to a more engaging, fulfilled, and effective mental health practice. Each empowering episode can stand alone as a continuing education pod course or a very valuable professional or personal resource with insightful expert interviews, practical resources, industry news, and lots of inspiration. We help the modern therapist thrive at work. Now let's welcome your host, a dedicated therapist and passionate educator, Shaina Siber, LCSW.
Welcome to the Affirming Minds Podcast. I'm your host, Shaina Siber. I'm so happy that you tuned in today. This show is for educational purposes only and is not a substitute for professional treatment or clinical supervision. If you're in need of support, please reach out to a licensed mental health professional in your area. Whole clinical examples shared are fully de-identified, composites, or vignettes. No real client information is ever disclosed. If you're interested in earning continuing education credits for this episode, head to affirmmentalhealth.com. Our membership gives you access to CEs for live virtual workshops, self-study webinars, and eligible podcast episodes right here on the Affirming Minds podcast. Today, we're exploring an approach that helps clients literally rewrite the stories of their lives: narrative therapy. My guest is Phil Lane, LCSW, a psychotherapist in private practice, and the author of Understanding and Coping with Illness Anxiety, Overcoming Panic and Panic Attacks, and the book we're going to discuss today, the Narrative Therapy Workbook for Self-Esteem. Rewrite your story, overcome imposter syndrome and feelings of inadequacy, and build lasting confidence. Phil writes and practices from a humanistic perspective with a commitment to normalizing and de-stigmatizing the struggles so many of us face. So what is narrative therapy? Narrative therapy is a collaborative counseling approach that views people as separate from their problems. Instead of labeling someone as an anxious person, narrative therapy helps the client say, "I live with anxiety." That distance allows people to challenge rigid, problem-saturated stories and re-author narratives that highlight strengths, values, and resilience. Narrative therapy grew out of postmodern ideas in the 1980s developed by Michael White in Australia and David Epstein in New Zealand. Postmodern simply means it challenges the idea that there's one fixed truth about who we are. Instead, it recognizes that our identities are shaped by the stories we've learned, the language we use, and the cultural messages around us. White and Epstein wanted therapy to move away from labeling people as the problem and instead focus on the problem being the problem. Clinically, narrative therapy has been applied with individuals, couples, families, and communities. It has shown promise in work with anxiety, depression, trauma, grief, eating disorders, identity development, and self-esteem. It is especially powerful for clients who feel stuck in shame or deficit-based narratives because it opens up space for alternative stories that are more hopeful and empowering. The evidence base is growing. Systemic reviews highlight applications across eating disorders, anxiety, and trauma. Randomized controlled trials show narrative therapy can increase resilience in foster children and reduce loneliness in older adults. While the research continues to develop, findings support what many clinicians observe. Narrative therapy strengthens agency, meaning-making, and self-esteem. In today's episode, you'll walk away with practical tools you can start using right away, like how to externalize problems so clients see themselves as separate from their struggles, how to uncover missing story parts that expand identity beyond deficit-based narratives, and how to use clinical interventions like letter writing and re-authoring questions as powerful tools for shifting client stories. I'm so excited to dive into this conversation with Phil and explore how narrative therapy can enrich your work. Let's get started. Thank you so much for being here. I was so grateful that I got to read your book, and I know listeners are going to get so much out of our conversation today. So let's start by getting to know you a bit better. Can you introduce yourself and tell us what drew you to narrative therapy in your clinical work?
Sure. First of all, thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. So I'm an LCSW, licensed clinical social worker. I actually had a previous career in the education field and went back to school when I was in my 30s and studied social work, got my master's. So that's how I got into the field. I started working with adolescents, and since then I've grown my practice to working with really age 13 plus. My specialties are anxiety, panic, self-esteem, men's issues, life transitions, things of that nature. Narrative therapy for me is all about storytelling. It's about the story that we tell about ourselves. I've always been a lover of story and of narrative. I often tell people that as a little kid, I was the kind of kid that could go up to my room and just read a book and be left alone for hours. There's something about story and narrative that has always appealed to me. Early in my career, I actually ran a narrative therapy group for adolescents. And I didn't really know what I was doing at the time. I was very new in the field, but the response from the clients was unbelievable. And I thought, wow, there's really power to narrative. There's really power to story. And from there, I learned a lot about narrative therapy. I did a lot of research into it. Obviously, I ended up writing a book about it. So that was my introduction into narrative therapy. I never would have known that I was going to become somebody who would do narrative therapy, let alone write a book about it. But that's how I arrived here.
Yeah, I love that. And what inspired you to write this book, which is a huge undertaking and a huge commitment? So, did that start percolating as an idea? What sort of compelled you to do that?
It's unbelievable how things happen. I wrote a previous book about illness anxiety, which is something that I've coped with in my life. I had no intention of having it published. I actually was like writing it more for myself. I ended up being lucky enough to have it picked up by a publisher. And I thought, wow, I guess I can do this. I guess I can actually be an author first. So narrative therapy was a natural topic for me to write about. And I'd written a few articles about it. I'd written something for my Psychology Today blog. And actually, an editor approached me and said, we're looking for a book on narrative therapy. I read your Psychology Today article. What do you think about putting something together? And that's how that came about.
Yeah, yeah, I love that. And I think this particular book, the Narrative Therapy Workbook for Self-Esteem, it doesn't surprise me your sort of parlay into authorship started with you writing something that could be used for yourself, because I think that sort of comes through in this, that it just feels so seamless. I am someone who cares deeply about access and dissemination, and it's not always easy to translate psychological therapeutic concepts to a book in a way that feels like it can be doable either with as an adjunct to therapy or done solo. And I think you really accomplished that well, which is fantastic.
Wow. Yeah. Thank you so much. And that was part of it. You're in the field. So obviously, we read some psychology books that are very clinical. There's not really a humanistic element to it, but humanism is a huge part of my practice. So I really wanted that to come through in the book. I wanted it to be both an end user book, so a book that a therapy client could use, or just a layperson who's
Yeah.
looking through the psychology section at a bookstore and says, this is interesting. I think I'll give this a shot. And I also wanted it to be something that would benefit clinicians. So that really was the goal, for it to really aim for a general readership.
Yeah, amazing. For some of our listeners who may not be familiar, would you give us a broad strokes definition of what narrative therapy?
Sure. In the simplest terms possible, I would say it's a curiosity driven exploration of the stories that we tell about ourselves. And from there, it's a broadening of the story that we tell about ourselves.
Yeah, yeah, that's really helpful. One of the things that you sort of started to position early in this book is this idea of dominant narratives. But you're setting that frame that we really do tell ourselves stories, even if we are not in the therapeutic space, even if this isn't like we have a way of narrating our lives. So, what is the role of dominant narratives and how do they shape the way people see themselves and experience the world?
Well, I think the role of dominant narratives is that it's a way for us to, in very simple terms, define ourselves, classify ourselves. The problem is that sometimes that's an oversimplification. And I'll give you a personal example. Two dominant narratives that I've had at different times in my life. Number one, I'm an anxious guy. Number two, I'm a late bloomer. And those dominant narratives, as you can hear, are very singularly focused. What's one thing? I'm an anxious guy. It ignores any other parts of the story. It ignores all the nuance of my story. So the purpose of a dominant narrative, I think why people go to a dominant narrative is we want to be able to define ourselves in a certain kind of way. Again, the problem is that sometimes that definition is incomplete. Sometimes that definition is more negative than it is positive. Sometimes that definition really ignores some of the intricacies of our lives.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful that we all do that to a certain extent. We tell ourselves, this is who we are. This is the kind of people we are. These are our dominant traits. And it is hard not to see things through those lenses and maximize everything that sort of confirms that preconceived bias and dismiss everything that's outside of it. So I definitely appreciate something about this book is getting people curious about expanding that lens and zooming out and doing it in a way that's accessible. I have done a lot of traditional cognitive behavioral therapy, and there's such a strong evidence base. But I think sometimes in the application, it's easier for some people to digest than others. And there's something about dominant narratives and just explaining the way that we think in this very natural way that is so accessible. Something that you started to also communicate is our stories become problem saturated. And I know you, in the way you were describing yourself as a late bloomer and an anxious person, it already sounds like a lot of your dominant narratives had this sort of the problems were centered, the deficits were centered. So can you explain to our listenership, what does it mean when someone's story is problem saturated, and how does that wind up playing a role in self-esteem?
Sure. Just think about saturation in terms of liquid, right? If you stand in the rain long enough, you get soaked. And so if we repeat this dominant narrative about ourselves often enough, we really become saturated in it. It really just sticks to us. The idea of being a late bloomer, for instance, I've told myself that because I had a son when I was in my 40s. And comparatively, that's late compared to other people. Being an anxious guy, yeah, I am somebody who's struggled with anxiety through my life. But when that story starts to saturate me, I am absolutely weighed down by it. The same way I am from being in like a torrential downpour, and then I'm so cold, I'm so heavy, I'm so soaked by it. So we need to start to look at how we saturate the way we feel about ourselves. What do we saturate this with? Are we saturating it with something that is holistic, a holistic, authentic view of ourselves? Or are we saturated by a singular story or a dominant narrative? And everything as we're going to go through this, you're going to see how all these things connect and they build on one another. So we have this dominant narrative. The dominant narrative then highlights one problem, and that saturates our sense of ourself.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I think that's really interesting too, because I think understanding our own, like how we're wired and our own biology, we have this wiring for negativity bias and amplifying perspectives of threat, amplifying problems to keep us safe. Is there anything that you have found helpful in getting people to notice the problem saturation and figure out that balance of recognizing our natural disposition for like probably automatically doing this sort of innately, and how we start to shift the narrative around that?
Yeah. So much of it is really self-compassion, which I talk about quite often in the book. If we're compassionate towards ourselves, we're very accepting of ourselves and we feel safer within ourselves. To your point, that's interesting what you said about CBT, because in cognitive behavioral therapy, it's about recognizing irrational thought versus rational thought, and sometimes finding a middle ground between the two. So I think it's very similar in narrative therapy. Yes, there are parts of me that are stories of challenge. There are places where I struggle. There are also places of great resilience. There are things that I'm very skilled at. There are things I'm not so skilled at. So being able to find that balance, to answer your question, really starts with being kind to ourselves. Calling myself an anxious guy all the time is not very kind to myself. Referring to myself as a late bloomer, which implies that I'm falling behind and I'm not doing things at the right pace or my development is off, is not very kind. So I think underlying it all, and this is one of the things I love about narrative therapy, is that there's an absolute need for self-compassion and a compassionate view of what we've been through and the lives that we live.
Yeah, I love that. A big part of the work, like the work of the workbook, is about externalizing the problem and utilizing story and utilizing narrative to do that. Can you explain what that means practically and why that can be so powerful for clients?
Sure, we want to think of it in terms of externalizing rather than internalizing. When we internalize the problem, it becomes our identity. That idea of I am an anxious guy. When we externalize the problem, the anxiety is over here and I'm over here. Maybe I struggle with anxiety at times, or sometimes I feel anxiety. It's now separate from me. It's not the definition of me or the essence of me. Externalizing problems is this really necessary isolation of the person being over here and the problem being over here. When we do that, what happens is that the problem becomes something that has affected us rather than something that defines us.
I think that's really powerful. And we were talking a bit offline because I really did enjoy the book and started implementing some of the exercises in my work. I'm a very integrative therapist, but the foundation of what I've been doing probably for the last decade is a lot of third wave cognitive behavioral therapies, a lot of compassion focused work, but particularly ACT. And what you're describing, I think, is such a accessible way to talk about the ACT concept of self as context versus self as content. And that's one of those sticky, tricky, when we take that ACT process and do it into practice, we can sometimes get really out there with the metaphor and things like this. And I've just found that some of these exercises in narrative therapy are a really practical but impactful way to do some of these processes, like a diffusion exercise. Essentially, what you're talking about is observing the problem as not fused with self, not fused with identity, not a fixed, permanent, unchangeable, unmovable state, but a part of an experience. And I think, that's particularly for folks that enjoy writing, enjoy reading, that relate to this sort of way of processing their thoughts or feelings. I just think this can be such an accessible way to communicate some of those concepts that can sometimes be a little bit tricky in application.
And I've said this to you offline that I have found a lot of crossover between ACT and narrative therapy as I wrote the workbook and as I've been doing my research on it. The context versus content that you mentioned sounds very similar to description versus explanation in narrative therapy. This idea that often we describe, we explain, but we don't actually describe. It's like surface versus depth. In ACT, you'll correct me if I'm wrong on this because you're the ACT expert, but isn't there a metaphor of a penny, a nickel, and a dime? And how people will often, maybe children would assume that the nickel is worth the most because it's the biggest.
Yeah.
And the dime is worth the least because it's the smallest. And that really sticks with me. And I think there's a crossover there to narrative therapy about being curious, trying to figure out what does this really mean beyond just what it seems on the surface. And that's so much of what narrative therapy is. And yes, I think there is a big crossover with ACT. So it's wonderful to hear somebody who practices ACT say, yeah, I can actually integrate a lot of these narrative approaches into that. I love the idea of being a multifaceted therapist who can draw on a lot of different modalities based on the client that you're working with.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love that sort of correlation you're drawing, because I think that piece of like how our negative evaluations and expectations of like past experiences wind up, we're writing the story before it has unfolded.
Yes, writing the story before it's unfolded is so true. Writing it before we've actually gathered all the details that we need in order to write the story. And I know that we'll get to missing story parts, but that's that idea. We leave a lot of stuff out. I don't know if part of that is that societally, we're such an impatient culture. We don't really like to go too deep. We like to keep it simple. So maybe in a way that's ingrained in us to keep it very simple. I'm anxious.
Yeah.
Think about how often clients will present themselves. They'll come into the office and they'll almost have their sort of diagnostic information prepared for you. This very short story. And part of the narrative work as a therapist is to really go deep, go into it, find so many more pieces of this. What underlies this? Maybe part of that is our societal training of keeping it very short, simple. Let's label it and let's not go too deep. But narrative therapy forces us to go deep.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think we are in a time of just holding our attention is becoming increasingly more difficult. And I think it does lend itself to that we sometimes simplifying things, labeling things. I think that I am finding more and more that folks are coming into treatment very validated and soothed by like labels that they see on social media. Like, I am this, someone has wrapped it up in a bow. And I think, like you said, that curiosity about it. But I think there are some people that are seeking, tell me who I am, tell me what I am, probably like what
Right.
explains everything about me.
But wouldn't it be great to think about that in a more authentic, holistic way? Again, that's the idea. And hopefully when people go through the workbook, they experience that. Go, wow, I found layers of myself that I wasn't even thinking about, because I have been encapsulating myself in this very short sort of summary of what my story is. When I work with adolescent clients, I sometimes bring up to them how a Snapchat story and an Instagram story are extremely short. They can only be a certain amount of time, and they actually disappear after 24 hours. So they're not real narratives. They're not real stories.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it sounds like you're metaphorically trying to take a Snapchat story and encourage, actually, let's write a novel instead. Let's do a long form podcast
That's right.
instead.
Yes, exactly right. Because there's so much that has to be cut out and edited out if it's only going to be this short little thing.
Yeah. And a good segue to, as you were starting to mention before, the missing story parts is something that you speak to in the book. Can you talk us through that a little bit, and why is uncovering those overlooked pieces so important?
Yeah, absolutely. If you were reading a novel, but you said, I'm going to read every other chapter. Yeah, I'm not going to read the whole thing. I'm not going to read it in sequence, and I'll just ignore a lot of the information. You really wouldn't understand the book very well. You might get the broad strokes, but you'd certainly miss a lot. And that's what we do when we ignore certain parts of our story. So these are parts of the story that have been ignored, they've been minimized, and they've been obscured. And they've been minimized and obscured by the dominant problem saturated narrative. So if I'm just Phil, the anxious guy, that leaves no room for Phil, the father, Phil, the husband, Phil, the therapist, Phil, the writer, Phil, the gardener, Phil, the tortured Mets fan, Phil, the all those sorts of things. So that's what the missing story parts are. It's a very literal definition. They are the parts of the story that are missing from the dominant narrative, particularly the problem saturated dominant narrative.
Yeah, absolutely. That's really helpful. And can you speak a little bit? And I think you really set the frame in the book in a way that's helpful. When you're thinking about clients this may be appropriate for, do clients start to get intimidated if they feel like they're not great writers, if they're like me, like I can't spell? What are some of are there any things you're thinking about when you want to integrate this, or you feel like this is going to be a really good fit for someone?
I'm a very conversational therapist. I'm really not the type of therapist that's going to say, okay, buckle up because we're going to do narrative therapy right now.
Your quill out.
And so it's maybe it's just the way I practice. As I mentioned before, I take a humanistic approach, an existential approach. I may mention to a client as we're talking or as the client is telling me about themselves, I might say, that sounds like a dominant narrative that you have. And I might give a little explanation of what a dominant narrative is. It really is, narrative therapy really is something that can be woven in to the fabric of a psychotherapy session. And you certainly, unless you have a client who's really curious about it, you don't really have to present it in this educational way. This is what this is called, and this is the definition of that. I know this is ironic for somebody who wrote a workbook about it. But to your question, really, I'm thinking more for clinicians. How might you integrate this? Start to point out with curiosity, it sounds like there's other parts of the story there. Tell me about some of those parts of the story. Invite the client to share the story. Even though clients typically come to therapy willingly, they're still on guard because we're human and sharing is vulnerable. And so we may not share certain things. So it's the therapist's job in a way to encourage some self-curiosity to help the client pull out some of these missing story parts. I think that narrative therapy, or at least elements of it, can be useful for almost any client, because anybody who lives in this world has some connection to story, whether it's through loving music and the lyrics to songs, or it's loving movies or loving reading, or I don't know, even visual art tells a story. So I think there's a natural connection to almost all clients. For the clinician, it's a matter of how to weave it in and how to integrate and what parts will work for what client.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love that you're mentioning that it can be weaved into so many different practices. We have a lot of clinicians that tune in that do parts work, that do EMDR, that are doing formal DBT. And there was just some languaging in your book that I felt was so universal. There's this acronym that you use in the beginning to, I think, orient people and encourage them. The acronym is FREE, for freedom, raw, expansive, and empathy. And something you wrote in the part about empathy is having empathy towards the main character of your story. And that's when I thought that was like such a lovely way to frame it, especially in doing compassion work myself. It's tricky. People have complicated relationships with compassion. And sometimes that piece, that way that you language it, did a lot of things about automatically externalizing it. And when people can almost see themselves as a character in their story, I think accessing compassion earlier on can be easier to achieve in a way, because it's taking care of that version of you through the retelling of your experience and going forward. I think people can grasp onto that in a way.
And again, it's different in a book form versus a psychotherapy session form. A client might be turned off if in the first session they're just sitting down and I say, first of all, I just want to make sure that you really love yourself. Feel yourself as resilient and the hero of your journey. That might be like, you don't even know me. So that has to be at the beginning of the book. But that's something that, again, that weaving in process, helping the client to highlight some of those places where there has been great resilience, there's been survival and overcoming struggle. That's very interesting the way you put that. People have a complicated relationship with compassion. Yeah, we don't like to take compliments, and we bristle sometimes at hearing kind things about ourselves. But if you have a favorite movie, chances are that you really like the character. There's something about that character that you find very likable and very appealing. And so we need to look at ourselves the same way if we are going to see ourselves as the main character in our story.
Yeah, absolutely. In that missing story part you were saying about getting curious and exploring the story and exploring the narrative, and the example you shared about your own dominant narratives. Well, have there been situations where, in contrast to anxiety, you showed up and you felt bold or brave, or you felt calm, or you felt at peace, or you felt certainty? And I think that way of actually getting people to see this is something that is not abating them or missing from them, but might just be skip chapters, eliminated paragraphs. And how do you bring that back in where they can actually explore their own experiences in a different way?
Yeah, these undiscovered parts of our story.
Yeah, absolutely. And now a quick word about our amazing sponsor, Jane. Can we agree on something? Therapists are already doing enough. You're managing care, notes, scheduling, billing, all while holding space for everyone else. The last thing you need is a system that makes it harder. That's why I switched to Jane. It's intuitive, it's beautifully designed, and it just works. It saves me time and protects my energy. The customer support alone is worth it, but the smoother workflow, that's what made it a long-term solution for me. Use code AFFIRM1MO to get a 1-month grace period. Switch to Jane and see what it feels like to be supported by your EHR for once. Time to decide if Jane's a better fit. Big thanks to Jane for supporting this podcast. And now back to the interview. You used framework of landscapes of action and landscapes of identity. Can you walk us through what you mean by those two terms and how that helps folks more holistically in this practice?
Sure. Start by just asking listeners to just picture a landscape, almost like when you're up in an airplane and you can see this very vast landscape down below. From that height, you can't really see what I call in the book the sub-landscapes. There's maybe towns and cities and villages and farms and mountains and hills and all those things. That's what the landscape of action is. It's all these sort of sub-narratives. And the way we do it in narrative therapy is we try to look at it in a timeline form. So we might start with like where I'm from, where I was born, where I grew up, how I grew up, what my parents were like, what my parents' beliefs were, what my beliefs were. These are all the things that have happened in my story. The landscape of identity is then what we conclude from the landscape of action. So if I grow up in I don't know, for example, a very small town and very conservative values, what I conclude about that is the landscape of identity. And narrative therapy encourages us to question that, to look into it, to pull it apart, to delve into it, to see if it's really authentic to how we feel and to what our values are.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a very interesting way to pull in values work and get people thinking about it and walking through those landscapes. You talk about the power of language in shaping our stories. How do words and phrases that people use about themselves with regularity, how do they reinforce problems? How do they hurt? How do they help? What is the role of shifting language in some of the storytelling?
Their words have connotation, they carry meaning. So the words we choose are very important. They inform our feelings about ourselves. The thing that a lot of therapists find cheesy, the feelings wheel. I don't know if you have one. But
No, I do. I'm one of those people that has that reaction to it a little bit.
exactly. But there is something good about the feelings wheel, which is that it broadens the terminology. It takes like angry and it gives you all these nuanced descriptions of angry.
Yeah.
So that's what we need to do with the language. Like being an anxious guy, okay, but maybe that means I'm planful. Maybe it means maybe it's intention. Maybe I'm intentional. Maybe I think ahead. So the words we choose are super important. And we tend to often, like with the narrative, we squeeze it and we narrow it and we make it very simplistic. It's I'm good or I'm bad. And of course, you can go on a discussion about guilt and shame from there. So the words that we use have a direct impact on our self-esteem and how we feel about ourselves and how we tell our story about ourselves.
Yeah, no, I think that's very true. And I think that piece about the feeling wheel has these gradient, right? And then I think that opens up that expansive language, just especially if we have strong symbolic in the way our kind of minds work and understand words and phrases that kind of conjure up certain negative connotations with certain languaging of things. But it sounds like you even go beyond that of saying, is there a way to posit this as a strength, or is there a way to posit this as a gift, or is
there another side? Is there another side? What's the other side of the prism? In the book, I give a clinical vignette of a client who describes herself as a square peg in a round hole. Very specific way to say, yeah, I'm weird.
Yeah.
I'm abnormal.
Oh.
And the book takes you through this, of course, but upon further discussion and exploration of her story, she's actually really an interesting person. She has unique interests. She's skilled. She sees herself as the odd duck or the square peg in the round hole simply because she's oversimplifying the definition. And by choosing that languaging, she's denying these other parts of herself.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I can think even in my own life, maybe if I see myself as not polished and me rebranding to that, like, no, I'm authentic. That, no, my rebrand of it. And even like within my family, I think my kids and my husband and I think we reclaimed the word weird, like we've taken it back as like so it sounds like being very intentional about what the language means.
I feel like maybe the current generation is really good at doing that. They'll reframe a word nerd or something like, fly your nerd flag, things like that. Like it means authentic, it means unique. So we have the power to do this. Narrative therapy helps us allow ourselves to challenge some of this wording and languaging that we use. And again, just like the dominant narrative and the problem saturation, if we use it enough, it becomes habitual. It just becomes second nature and we don't even question it.
Absolutely. A lot of my work has been in LGBTQ affirming care, and just in the years that I've practiced over the last 15 years, when I was a child, adolescent, a word like queer was a slur. It was used in an incredibly derogatory term. And now it's become like a identity of pride that it's been used as like a framing of political resistance to heteronormative narrative. So the one little tiny word of just seeing the evolution, because I think people took back the narrative. I think that is probably the best way to describe what was done within the LGBT community around that particular term.
That is a great example. And in the book, I actually give another clinical example of a man who, a part of the LGBT community, but grew up in the 1960s and 70s and grew up in a very small town, conservative values, was not accepted by his parents for being gay. And he would describe himself as having been sneaky and lived a sneaky life. And as we really delved into that, he was not sneaky. In order to be the authentic version of himself, he had to be very careful. He had to be careful around his own family because they didn't necessarily accept him. He had to be careful socially, which still happens, of course, happened to a different degree. if you go back 40 or 50 years. So we really, in a session, we would start to challenge that the choice of that word sneaky.
Yeah. Yeah. It is, I could nerd out and go on like a whole tangent about this, but it is just, it is fascinating to me how language is so loaded and there is so much cultural context that goes into this languaging. I come up against a lot in pride, like being proud of yourself, and pride being a connotation of arrogance and sin and ego. And I think when I was starting to do some of like work, there would be some languaging I had because I didn't necessarily have that framework, that talking about like self-pride. What are you proud of yourself for? And I had to over time evolve my languaging to be things like noticing and self-appreciation and what do you appreciate yourself and others, because for so many people I wound up encountering, that word was so loaded and had such different context than I was approaching the word with. So I think just even in my position as a clinician, understanding how words hit and how different readers are going to have different experiences of the language itself.
I wonder if do you also find that with the word selfish? I find that a lot as a clinician, this real negative connotation to quote being selfish. And on another podcast, I don't know who said it, but somebody said he uses the word self-full in his sessions instead. So again, it's very slight language change, but changes the connotation and changes the story that we tell that's attached to that particular word.
Yeah, absolutely. I do. I think there's like a language gap because even my own experience of selfish is it being a negative thing. And when we try to have this experience of self-prioritization, self-compassion, caring about yourself, that like caring about yourself is something to value, to understand your inherent worthiness. I think that there is a direct correlation to this experience of selfishness and not being innately a negative thing. So I'm all for the rebranding of the word self. I think we need more words. We need more words to communicate that message of self-love and all of the gradients, right? We need a feeling for taking care of yourself. We need more words. I really do think that's like a vacuum in our languaging.
Yes.
The workbook emphasizes looking for unique outcomes. Can you explain what unique outcomes are and how identifying them can open things up for clients?
Sure. Do you have any memory of choose your own ending books?
Oh yeah, choose your own adventure. Those are
Choose your
the
own
best.
adventure.
Yeah, yeah.
That's what unique outcomes are. It's like there's a lot of possibilities, real and not so much imagined, but perspective, if you will.
Oh.
So unique outcomes is, again, this curiosity-driven sort of mentality of what is possible. What am I not seeing as a possibility that actually is a possibility? To give you an example, the late bloomer. The unique outcomes for the late bloomer are going into things with a ton of life experience, more life experience maybe than peers have. For me, becoming a therapist in my 30s, I had already lived through a lot of stuff at that time. Not to say that a younger therapist was not as good, it was just different experience. I felt like it gave me a unique perspective. Becoming a dad in my 40s, yeah, I had a lot of time to have fun. There's a unique outcome for you. No, I might have more back pain because I'm a little older as a dad. These other unique outcomes, a different view on life, different way of parenting, having had a few more years behind me. So it's the possibilities that we tend to ignore or we tend to tell ourselves are not even a part of this story.
Yeah. And I appreciate unique outcomes, like the word unique, because I think we have a tendency to compare our situation to some imagined optimal version of events. And I think there can also be a gear towards like sometimes a toxic positivity, when I know that this is largely centered on people struggling with self-esteem issues. And there's, I'm sure, broad applications of this. And I imagine many people that you encountered that have self-esteem issues have trauma histories, and being able to not necessarily gear people towards like, how did this work for you? What was the blessing in this? But I think unique outcomes is a perspective taking exercise that is getting at that. Can you find what is purposeful for you here? Can you find what's meaningful for you here in a way that's not like pushing people towards being like, you better be happy for these things that happen to you?
Purposeful, meaningful are the words, right? Rather than can you find something to smile about through the trauma you've been through? And you have to be very careful with this as a clinician. It's a very fine line. I think it's like post-traumatic stress and post-traumatic growth.
Yeah.
Being able to view some of what you've come through as being growth. But again, you really have to be careful that it doesn't come off as toxic positivity or being like, people have it worse. Look, that's never going to help anybody.
Absolutely. Absolutely. But I think that's a really helpful way to phrase it. That is not going to evoke that defensiveness that might come up around it. So you provide in the book reauthoring questions. Listeners, go buy the book. Okay, explore it for yourself, dig into it. I think it really can enhance your therapy, but maybe just giving us like a little bit of insight into what are some of the questions that you start to pose to clients to start to do this reauthoring.
Yeah, just as an example, if a client tells you, this is what I think about something in the world, right? It might be like, okay, what does that do for you? Or what does that bring you? The way we phrase it in narrative therapy, to be official about it, is what are your ways of thinking about and viewing life that may stand behind your dominant narrative? So what has fed the dominant narrative? And that gets the client thinking about, where did this come from? Where did I cultivate this belief or this belief about myself? And maybe it even gets them thinking, maybe this isn't my belief. Maybe this is mom or dad's belief. Maybe this is society's belief. So another reauthoring question then would be, does this way of thinking bring you towards yourself or away from yourself? Meaning towards your authentic self or away from your authentic self? So the idea of these reauthoring questions is to really start to investigate, like really investigate some of these dominant narratives and dominant beliefs that we have about ourselves. And as the clinician, we guide that by just this gentle questioning of, okay, how does that bring you towards authenticity, or do you feel that brings you away from your authentic self? How does this work in practice in your life? Maybe a client says, it doesn't really work well in practice in my life. And that opens the door to this further investigation. So if narrative therapy weren't called narrative therapy, I think it would be called like investigative self-therapy or something like that, because that's really what it is investigation of narratives that we carry and that have gone unquestioned.
Yeah, absolutely. And I really am just also seeing those overlaps with acceptance and commitment therapy. Like we talk about it through the languaging. Is this like workable or unworkable? And is it in terms of that workability is it moving towards the life that you want for yourself? Is it moving maybe in narrative towards the story that you're, authoring for yourself?
Right. Yeah, definitely very similar in that regard. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the practices you include in the workbook is letter writing to the problem. What is helpful about this exercise? Why do you think it's resonating with people that kind of do this work?
I think because it gives you an opportunity to directly address the problem. Like, how often do we get to do that? Get to do something directly to our anxiety or to our trauma or something like that. When I was doing that narrative therapy group with the adolescents, we did that as a prompt in one session. I think the prompt was, write a letter to your problem or your challenge. And one young lady wrote, it was so funny, but she wrote, "Dear anxiety, F you, sincerely," and then she signed off on it. That was the whole letter. And there was like a round of applause from the group. They just loved it because it was this opportunity to really authentically and emotionally just straight up address the problem. Now, you might go deeper into that letter. You might talk about how anxiety, I don't really need you anymore, or whatever it is. But I think it's this, to answer your question, it's the opportunity to just talk to it.
Yeah.
Tell it what you want to tell it. It's always telling us.
Yeah.
So now we get to tell it.
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think that could also open up like why it's a lot of people doing substance use work or would say substance use was the problem. It was my solution to the problem. Like I was trying to solve other problems by using this. And I can see it also opens up that idea of like, why was that functional for so long rather than shaming yourself for utilizing anxiety was protecting you probably at some point, and it may have overutilized, saturated to the point where we can use that exercise to also explore that ambivalence and maybe gently understand why certain things have been dominant mechanisms of coping, and we can also make other choices.
Absolutely. If I were to write a letter to my anxiety, part of it would be to thank it, honestly, which might seem ironic, but I would thank it for having served the purpose that it served for a time.
Yeah.
But then I would be like, but I might have hung on to you a little too long.
Yeah.
And so I'm ready to let you go or move past you. So I think you're so right. It creates an opportunity to really just go even deeper into it, why it was there, what it did for us. And for some of this, as we go through the narrative, it's like shedding the old narrative, grieving the old narrative, letting the old narrative go, and being able to have this really authentic, updated version.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, I think that can be really powerful. You also encourage using different mediums, which I love, which is that writing can be integrated, that music can be integrated, all sorts of different mechanisms of expression. It sounded like you were urging the readers should think about as part of storytelling. Can you talk a little bit more about that and how different modalities of creative expression can be used to enhance narrative therapy work?
Sure. So many of these mediums, the work is predicated on human experience. And I think there's really obvious ones. You read a great novel and it makes sense to you. And you go, I can relate to that. But again, there's these other modes that maybe we don't necessarily look at as being narrative, but they really are. Even like pop songs, lyrics that talk about relationships or talk about struggles. We can relate to that. And there's a story. It's 3 minutes of a story. I mentioned before visual art. You can go into the Museum of Art, whatever it is, and many of these paintings that you see, sculptures, they tell a story. So the idea is to be able to find the narrative in all of these things. Any work of art was created by a human being based on some human experience.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that it's an exercise I do sometimes with folks that I think is getting at the heart of narrative therapy, which is doing like a soundtrack of their life and working through. And then what would be your anthem for this? And I think it just maybe speaks to people think and process things differently. I'm a person who I like to talk, and like that's part of the podcast. I do verbal therapy. I'm a talker, but I could see for some people getting it out of the head onto paper, like the actual physical act of writing it down might be so powerful, or utilizing art itself to do it, or movement of some kind. So I always appreciate a therapeutic practice that has flexibility and can really honor who the individual person is in doing that.
Yeah, and that was a big part of the book was I didn't want readers to think I'm not really into reading, so this book's not for me. No, it's the idea of story, and everybody has a connection to story and a relationship with story. It doesn't only have to be through, reading the great American novel.
Right. Absolutely. In later in the workbook, you explore how societal and family narratives can influence self-esteem. How can clinicians help clients start to question these bigger external forces that may be showing up in the story?
Yeah, I made this term up, but it's something I remind myself in my own sessions that I want to be abundantly curious. So I think clinicians need to use abundant curiosity, an abundance of curiosity. We must be curious as to why do you feel that way? Where did that belief come from? Where have you heard that? Where have you seen that belief in practice? So I don't know, because I work a lot with Guy. Guy comes in and says, I don't think I'm manly enough. A lot to explore there about where did that come from? Is that a societal construct? Is that something you've seen in media? Is it something that, your father, your grandfather displayed? So it's the curiosity of the clinician that allows the client to really start to pull on some threads and say, where did this come from? Does this belong to me? And that's the bigger thing, because you talked about reclamation earlier in the conversation. We are trying to reclaim our own story here. So we want to find and highlight those parts that actually belong to somewhere else or some other institution or some other person. There's so many social constructs. And one of the ones I work with a ton is just the idea of masculinity. It's a great one as an example, because we all know how toxic some of those sort of beliefs are, or those norms, if you call them that. So being able to really investigate those and tear them apart, tear them down, see what's wrong with them. So clinician is the guide to being able to question some of the origins of some of these.
Absolutely. And I really love the way you phrase that. Does this belong to me? And going back to what we were talking about before, like that, reclaiming queer as actually like a place of empowerment. I can imagine things like manliness or manhood, that reclamation process. Do these messages about masculinity, do they resonate with you? Do you feel that they are aligned with who you are and where your story is going? And you don't have to abandon the pursuit of being masculine. You may just be reworking and reimagining what actually that means for you.
Exactly right. And so that goes back to what we were talking about with values. And that's why values and value, assessing our own values and knowing our own values is a big part of narrative therapy. You can't tell your accurate story if you're not aligned with what your values are.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I feel like we covered so much ground, but I could talk to you so much because, again, I thought the book was fantastic. And I think it's a really beautiful treatment. And I just have gotten a lot of abundant curiosity about it because I do think it really maps on well with ACT. And I think there's a really like overlay of no matter what therapeutic process people or modality people are primarily working with, how I can see how these exercises can really be an amplifier, an enhancer. So can you tell folks where they can buy the book, where they can find you, learn more about this important work that you're doing?
Sure. On my website, I have everything. You can learn about me on my website, and there are links to the book, and that is phil-lane.com. Everything's online. I also have an Instagram at therapist_Phil. And I often post things about the book, but also just general mental health content there.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for being here. I loved our conversation today.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Thank you for joining our community on the Affirming Minds podcast. If you loved this episode as much as we did, please follow us wherever you listen to your podcasts and share it on your socials. If you want more information about how this podcast can add to your continuing education credits, visit affirmmentalhealth.com. And remember, let's affirm, heal, and grow together.